Chapter 1. The Look in His Eyes. There was a certain look in Roger Whitmore's eyes that made people uneasy, a mix of entitlement and quiet disdain, like the world had somehow disappointed him just by existing the way it did. In his mid-50s, with salt and pepper hair slicked back too neatly, Roger looked every bit the successful contractor he was, running a small but thriving business in the suburbs of Charleston, South Carolina. He had money, influence, and a nice house in a neighborhood where kids rode bikes in cul-de-sacs and people waved just because it was polite. But beneath the southern charm and manicured lawns was something darker. Roger didn't talk about it much, but he didn't have to. He didn't trust those people, and he sure didn't want them near his daughter, his home, or his business. He believed in order, in the way things used to be. And although the world was changing, Roger wasn't changing with it. That morning was hot already, the kind of southern heat that clung to your skin like guilt. Roger was fixing the latch on the backyard gate while his 10-year-old daughter, Emily, played on the trampoline. Her laughter rang through the air, bright and innocent, untouched by the narrow beliefs her father carried like bricks in his chest. From across the fence, a young black man was unloading mulch from a pickup. He wore a sleeveless shirt and had arms toned from honest labor. Roger's eyes narrowed. Damn landscaping company sent one of them again, he muttered under his breath, wiping sweat off his brow. Emily didn't notice her father's tone or his gaze. She just kept bouncing, giggling, calling out to him. "Daddy, watch this flip." Roger forced a smile. "That's my girl." But he kept glancing toward the neighbor's yard, toward the black man who was now spreading mulch near the driveway, humming softly to himself. Roger didn't know his name, didn't care to. Chapter 2. Unexpected Storm. Later that afternoon, clouds rolled in with a vengeance. Thunder cracked above as the wind kicked up, tossing leaves and branches across lawns. Roger cursed and rushed outside to pull down the patio umbrella, while Emily trailed behind, barefoot and wide-eyed. "Stay inside, baby," he barked. "But my bunny's still out there," she cried. Roger looked toward the far end of the yard. Sure enough, Emily's favorite stuffed bunny lay near the edge of the creek that ran behind their property. The storm had stirred the waters, and the bank looked slick and dangerous. Before he could stop her, Emily darted out, determined to rescue it. "Emily!" Roger screamed. "Get back here!" She didn't listen. The grass was wet. Her small feet slipped, and within seconds she was sliding down the muddy bank, arms flailing, eyes wide with terror. Then, a splash. Roger ran as fast as he could, heart pounding, shouting her name over and over. But the water was too fast, the mud too thick. He skidded and nearly fell himself, shouting helplessly at the swirling creek. "Emily!" Then a voice cut through the storm. "I got her!" Roger turned. It was the black man, the same one he had side-eyed all morning. He was running, full speed, jumping over the fence like it was nothing. Without hesitation, he dove into the creek. For a split second, Roger stood frozen. Time slowed. The absurdity of it all hit him like a punch to the gut. This can't be real. But it was. The man surfaced seconds later, one arm wrapped around Emily, pulling her to the side with practiced skill. He lifted her gently onto the muddy bank, coughing and soaked but alive. Roger rushed over, dropping to his knees. "Emily! Baby, are you okay?" She coughed and whimpered, clinging to her rescuer. He saved me, Daddy." Roger reached out to take her, but she wouldn't let go right away. She looked up at the man with awe. "Thank you," she whispered. The man smiled gently. "No problem, sweetheart." And that was when Roger looked into his eyes, really looked, and saw no malice, no agenda, no stereotype. Just a human being who had done what he himself hadn't been able to do. Save his daughter. Chapter 3. A name he never cared to know. The ambulance came. Emily was fine, shaken but unharmed. Roger insisted they go to the hospital just in case, but doctors confirmed she was okay. The man who saved her didn't wait for applause. He dried off using a towel someone handed him and was about to leave when Roger finally approached him. "Wait," Roger said, unsure what words to even use. The man turned. I never got your name." He raised an eyebrow, not mocking, just surprised. "It's Marcus. Marcus Bell." Roger nodded, awkward. I'm Roger. That's my daughter, Emily. Marcus looked past him. She's a brave little girl. There was a silence. One of those heavy, complicated silences, full of things left unsaid. I owe you, Roger finally said, his voice tight. You saved her life. Marcus shrugged. She needed help. That's all. But it wasn't all, and they both knew it. Chapter 4. Under the surface that night, Roger sat in his living room, staring at a blank TV screen, a beer untouched on the table beside him. His wife, Karen, yes, ironically, her name really was Karen, sat nearby, scrolling through her phone. Are you okay? She asked, glancing at him. He nodded slowly. Yeah, just thinking. About what? Roger hesitated. That man. Marcus. I never would have guessed. Karen gave him a sharp look. What? That he'd be the one to save her? Roger didn't answer, but his silence was loud. Karen sighed. Roger, it's not 1955. You need to let go of whatever ideas you grew up with. The world isn't black and white, literally or figuratively. Roger rubbed his face with both hands. I know. It's just what? He looked up at her, vulnerable in a way she hadn't seen in years. It messed with my head. I thought I had everything figured out, you know? Who people are. What kind of men are good, which ones aren't. Then, this guy jumps into a river to save my daughter and makes me look like a damn coward. Karen reached over and placed her hand on his. He didn't make you look like a coward. He made you look human. Chapter 5. Change doesn't announce itself over the next few days. Roger couldn't stop thinking about Marcus. He saw him again the following week, working another job nearby. This time Roger didn't narrow his eyes. He didn't mutter. He watched quietly, wrestling with something inside. Later that day he crossed the street. Hey, Marcus. The man looked up from a wheelbarrow full of dirt. Hey. Roger hesitated, then held out his hand. You got time for lunch? Marcus looked at him, really looked, like he was searching for sarcasm, for the punchline. But there wasn't one. He wiped his hands and nodded. Sure. Chapter 6. Burgers and Bridges. They sat across from each other at a local diner. Roger in his crisp polo, Marcus in his work shirt still smelling faintly of mulch and sun. Neither man spoke for a while after the waitress left with their orders. It was awkward, but necessary. So, Roger finally said, fiddling with the sugar packets on the table. You been doing landscaping long? Marcus took a sip of water. About 10 years. Started with my uncle's company. Took over a few years back. Got your own business now? Yup. Bell Outdoor Services. Small but steady. Most of our work is residential. Roger nodded. That's impressive. Marcus raised an eyebrow. Didn't expect that, did you? Roger gave a sheepish smile. If I'm being honest, no, I didn't. Their burgers arrived. They ate in silence for a minute. I didn't grow up around many black folks, Roger said after a while, eyes on his plate. Town I was raised in was, let's just say, not very welcoming. Marcus chuckled dryly. No kidding. But I guess that's not an excuse. I carried a lot of that with me. Assumptions, fear, pride maybe. People do, Marcus said simply. It's what you do when you realize that matters. Roger nodded slowly. When you saved Emily, I didn't just see you differently. I saw myself differently. I froze, and you didn't. Marcus looked him in the eye. She needed help. That's it. Roger swallowed the lump in his throat. I want to do better. For the first time, Marcus smiled. Not a polite smile, but a real one. Then let's start here. Chapter 7. The Stare from Across the Fence. Back in the neighborhood, people talked. They always did. Word had spread about the rescue, how the Whitmore girl had nearly drowned and who'd pulled her out. Most neighbors had been surprised. Some had been shocked. A few quietly and not so quietly disapproved. Roger noticed the stares when he shook Marcus's hand in public, when they grabbed coffee together, when Emily ran to greet Marcus like he was a hero every time she saw him. He even caught Bob McAllister, his longtime golf buddy, grumbling under his breath. What the hell's gotten into Roger? One Saturday, Roger invited Marcus over for a barbecue. Just a few friends, he said. Keep it casual. But when guests arrived and saw Marcus on the back porch flipping burgers, the air shifted. Subtle. Tense. Roger didn't back down. He handed Marcus a beer, introduced him, laughed with him, stood beside him. Emily sat on Marcus's knee, showing him her drawings. Karen brought out lemonade and talked to him like they'd known each other for years. Bob McAllister pulled Roger aside. You really think this is the guy you want around your daughter? Roger looked him dead in the eye. He saved her life, Bob. That's more than I can say for anyone else standing here. Bob opened his mouth, closed it, walked away. Chapter 8. The First Real Apology. A few days later, Roger showed up at Marcus's place. Not to talk, not to debate, just to say something he'd been holding in. Marcus opened the door in gym shorts, surprised to see him. Hey, Roger said. You got a minute? Marcus nodded, letting him in. They sat on the porch as the sun dipped low, painting the sky in streaks of golden lavender. I came to say something, Roger said, taking off his cap and holding it in both hands. I never apologized. Not for how I looked at you. Not for the things I thought. Hell, for the things I've said in the past when I didn't think anyone was listening. You don't have to. No, Roger cut in. I do, because it matters. He looked away for a moment, then back at Marcus. I was wrong. You didn't just save Emily. You gave me a second chance to be a better man. And I don't want to waste it. Marcus looked at him a long time, the silence thick but not heavy. Then he extended his hand. You're already on your way, Roger. They shook hands. And in that moment, something old broke, and something new began. Chapter 9. Small Town, Big Change. The town of Rosefield had always been slow to change. There were churches older than most buildings in the county, and certain neighborhoods still held tight to unspoken codes about who belonged where. But something had shifted. When Roger started hiring Marcus's company for his business contracts, landscaping, maintenance, even office renovation, other clients followed. Not all at once, but slowly. And when Roger publicly thanked Marcus at a Chamber of Commerce event, calling him a man I trust with my business and my family, the room couldn't ignore it. Emily started drawing pictures of Marcus with capes and superhero emblems. Karen posted them on Facebook. One went viral. Then came the interview request from a local paper. Racist dad changed forever after black man saved his daughter. Roger declined the interview at first, but Marcus said something that stuck. If even one person sees it and rethinks their bias, it's worth it. So they did it. Together. Chapter 10. The Backyard Promise. One warm evening, Roger and Marcus sat again in the Whitmore backyard, the cicadas humming, and Emily chasing fireflies with a jar. Funny, isn't it? Roger said. How everything changed in a single afternoon. Storms do that, Marcus replied. Roger leaned back, letting the night air wash over him. You ever think we'll really get there? I mean, not just me and you, but all of us. Past the hate, the fear. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Not all at once, but maybe one backyard at a time. Roger nodded. Then we keep going, one backyard at a time. Chapter 11. When Hate Stops at the Door. Roger stood in the kitchen staring at his phone. He had just received a message from his estranged brother Doug, someone he hadn't spoken to in over 4 years. Their last conversation had ended in a shouting match over politics, race, and the old ways. Now, out of the blue, Doug had written, "Heard about what happened with Emily. So, you really let one of them in your house?" Roger's stomach turned. He walked out back, where Marcus was helping Emily plant a small tree they'd picked out together, a Japanese maple, her new favorite. Roger watched them for a while. The way Marcus spoke gently, explaining how deep to dig, how to water just enough. The way Emily smiled up at him, like he was family. Roger typed a reply to his brother and hit send. Yeah, and it's the best decision I ever made. Chapter 12. The Whispers of Old Friends. At church that Sunday, the air was heavier than usual, not because of the sermon, not because of the weather, but because Roger had walked in with Marcus and Marcus's mother, Loretta. whom Roger had invited personally. He didn't ask for permission, didn't give a warning. He just walked them up to the front pew and sat down like it was the most natural thing in the world. Heads turned. Whispers buzzed through the congregation like flies. After service, Pastor Hill approached, his face unreadable. "I'd like to invite Marcus to speak next Sunday," he said. "Share his story." Marcus blinked. "You sure about that?" Pastor Hill smiled. "If this congregation can sing about grace every week, it's about time we live it." Roger let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Chapter 13. The Sunday Speech. The following Sunday, the church was packed. Word had spread. People came curious, skeptical, even quietly disapproving. But when Marcus took the podium, the room hushed. "I didn't come here to talk about race," he began. "I came to talk about humanity." He told them the story of the creek, of the fear in Emily's eyes, of the way Roger had looked at him after it happened, not with suspicion, but with something else, something real. "I didn't save her because she was white. I didn't hesitate because her daddy had once looked at me like I didn't belong. I saved her because she was a child, and she needed saving. That's what love looks like, without conditions." By the time he finished, more than a few eyes were wet. Roger was one of them. Chapter 14. The first invite that really mattered. A few weeks later, Marcus invited Roger to dinner at his place. It wasn't fancy, just good food, warm smells, and the sound of laughter from his nieces and nephews who were visiting. Roger felt out of place at first, but then something shifted. Loretta brought him peach cobbler and said, "We don't care where you've been. We care where you're going." That night, Roger sat at a table full of people he once would have crossed the street to avoid. And for the first time in his life, he didn't feel like an outsider. He felt like a guest, and more importantly, like a friend. Chapter 15. Emily's Essay. One afternoon, Karen called Roger into the living room. "You have to read this," she said, handing him a piece of lined notebook paper. It was Emily's school essay, titled My Hero. Most kids pick Superman or their dad or a firefighter, but my hero is Marcus Bell. He saved me, but more than that, he changed my daddy. My daddy used to think people like Marcus were different, but now he knows Marcus is kind and strong and brave. I want to be like Marcus when I grow up. Maybe we all should. Roger sat down hard on the couch, the words blurring as tears welled up in his eyes. He looked at Karen, and for the first time in a long while, said the words he hadn't said since his daughter was born. "I want to be a better man." Chapter 16. The Call That Changed Everything. Months passed. Seasons shifted. Roger and Marcus began volunteering together at the local youth center, then at the town's first cross-community project to rebuild old homes in poorer neighborhoods. Then one day, Marcus called Roger. "I got a weird invitation," he said, laughing. "Some civic committee wants to give me an award." "That's not weird," Roger said. "That's overdue. They want me to speak, but I want you there too." "Aha," Roger's voice caught. "You want me to speak?" "Not just speak. Stand beside me." That night, the two men stood on a small stage in front of city officials, business leaders, and regular folks. Marcus told his story. Roger told his truth, and the crowd gave them a standing ovation. Chapter 17. A Town Takes Notice. What had started as whispers soon became conversations. Conversations became headlines. The local paper ran a front-page article, "Enemies No More, How a Life-Saving Moment Sparked a Lifelong Bond." The news traveled further than either Marcus or Roger expected. Regional news picked it up, then national outlets. A CNN producer reached out, then Good Morning America. Roger hesitated. "I didn't do anything worth interviewing for," he told Karen, but she smiled, brushing his shoulder. "You changed, Roger. That's something worth talking about." Marcus agreed. "There's a lot of people like who you were. Maybe they just need to hear from someone who made it out of that mindset." So they did it, together. Sitting side by side on a studio couch under bright lights, Roger Whitmore looked into a camera and admitted who he had been and who he had become. "I was wrong," he told America, "and I wouldn't have my daughter today if it weren't for the man I once judged without knowing a single thing about him." Chapter 18. Backlash and Bravery. For every person who praised Roger's transformation, there were 3 who scoffed at it. He received hate mail, emails saying he was turning his back on his own. A local business owner he'd known for 20 years called him a sellout. Doug, his brother, sent another text. Can't believe you'd throw your family under the bus for one good one. You'll regret this. Roger stared at the message and calmly deleted it. Then he blocked Doug's number. Marcus, meanwhile, took the attention in stride. He wasn't new to criticism. He had grown up with suspicion, side eyes, and being followed around stores. But now, standing beside someone like Roger, he found something he hadn't had before. Backup. Not just from an ally, but from a friend. We keep showing up, Marcus said one evening as they left a community panel. Even when they hate it. Especially then. Roger nodded. Every damn time. Chapter 19. Shared Spaces. Emily's birthday was coming up. She wanted a big party at the park. When Karen asked who she wanted to invite, Emily named half her class, and Marcus's nieces and nephews. They're the funniest, she said with a grin. Roger helped hang decorations, while Marcus grilled hot dogs and passed out juice boxes. The party wasn't segregated by race, income, or assumption. It was just kids laughing, chasing bubbles, and parents chatting while wiping frosting off faces. At one point, Roger sat on the edge of a picnic bench, watching Marcus organize a 3-legged race. You know, Roger said, sipping lemonade, 5 years ago, I'd never have pictured this. Marcus didn't look over, just smiled and said, 5 years ago, you wouldn't have been invited. Roger chuckled. Fair. Then Marcus added, glad you're here now. Chapter 20. When a heart opens that evening, after the party, Emily tugged on Roger's shirt. Daddy? Yeah, baby. Can Marcus be my godfather? Roger blinked. You're what now? My teacher said godparents are people who guide you when your parents can't. If anything ever happened, I'd want Marcus to take care of me. Roger knelt down, looking into her earnest little eyes. You really mean that? Emily nodded. He's my hero. And yours too, right? Roger didn't answer. He just hugged her. Later that week, he drove to Marcus's house, sat on the porch, and cleared his throat awkwardly. What's up? Marcus asked, sitting beside him. You ever been a godfather before? Marcus raised an eyebrow. No. Roger looked over. Wanna be one? Marcus smiled, wide and full of emotion. I'd be honored. Chapter 21. New traditions. Thanksgiving that year was different. Instead of hosting the usual all-white dinner with the same dry jokes and stale casserole, Roger and Karen invited Marcus and his family. Loretta brought sweet potato pie that made Karen question every recipe she'd ever made. They laughed, they prayed, and when Emily stood up and gave a toast, to Marcus, the best thing that ever happened to my daddy, the entire room clapped. Across the table, Roger raised his glass, eyes misty. To second chances, he added, and everyone drank to that. Chapter 22. The Ribbon Cutting. 1 year after the Creek rescue, the town opened a new community center, built with joint funding and led by a partnership between local leaders and volunteers. It was called the Bridge, symbolizing the connection between communities, stories, and generations. Roger and Marcus stood together as the mayor handed them the oversized ceremonial scissors. This is more than just a building, the mayor said. This is a reminder that change isn't just possible, it's already happening. Roger looked at Marcus. Want to do the honors? Marcus grinned. Only if we do it together. They cut the ribbon as cameras flashed and children cheered. Behind them stood a plaque that read, dedicated to unity, born from courage, and sealed by compassion. Doijai La Fan 5, to 20,000 on 1 Jan Huang 25,000 Maon 2. Kua Truyen, the racist couldn't believe his eyes when a black man saved his child. Kao Chuyen, Tiep Tuk Kai Thach Chio Sao Kam Shuk. Kakhui Sulan Tuakwa Taijoi Trong Kong Jongvar Trong Chin Nung Ngua Tung Bao Tun Hat. Chapter 23. When change rippled out, the local high school invited Marcus and Roger to speak at a Diversity Week assembly. Roger was nervous. I've spoken at fundraisers, dinners, even church. But high schoolers? They don't fake politeness. Marcus laughed. That's why it matters more. They'll remember if it's real. They stood on a gymnasium stage before hundreds of students. Some leaned back in their bleachers, arms crossed. Some scrolled phones. Others just looked curious. Then Marcus spoke. Racism doesn't always look like shouting or slurs. Sometimes it looks like silence, like fear, like deciding not to sit next to someone in the lunchroom. Roger stepped forward. I lived most of my life in that kind of silence. I believed things without question. Then one day the man I judged without knowing saved my little girl's life. The room quieted. And when that happened, I couldn't go back to the way I was, because once you see clearly, you can't unsee. By the time they finished, even the kids in the back rows were clapping. Afterward, a young boy, maybe 16, dark-skinned, eyes shy, walked up to Marcus. My dad's like how he used to be, the boy said, nodding toward Roger. You think he could change too? Marcus placed a hand on his shoulder. If mine could, yours can. Chapter 24. The Old Neighbor. There was one neighbor Roger had never quite gotten along with, Mr. Dwyer, a grumpy veteran in his 70s who prided himself on how things used to be. Dwyer rarely left his house except to yell at kids for stepping on his lawn. He had lived through a war, and maybe part of him was still stuck in a different kind of battlefield. One afternoon, Roger saw Marcus helping Emily ride her bike past Dwyer's house. Dwyer was watching from his porch. The next day, Dwyer walked across the street with something wrapped in foil. Roger opened the door. I heard the black fellow saved your girl, Dwyer said. Roger bristled. His name's Marcus. And yeah, he did. Dwyer looked down at the package in his hands. This is my late wife's cornbread recipe. He might like it. Roger blinked. I'll give it to him, he said, taking it. As Dwyer turned to go, he muttered, Guess we all gotta start somewhere. Chapter 25. The Interview That Went Global. It was supposed to be a 10-minute segment on a morning show. Instead, it went viral. A clip of Roger looking into the camera and saying, Hate nearly cost me everything. Love saved my daughter. Made its way across the internet. News sites picked it up. TikToks echoed his words. Comment sections filled with stories of people confronting their own bias. People reached out. Black fathers, white grandmothers, young activists, old skeptics. Karen created a Facebook page called The Bridge Project. The mission? Share stories of unexpected unity. Within weeks, thousands followed. Marcus and Roger didn't ask for fame, but they knew this wasn't just about them anymore. It was about momentum. Chapter 26. A Call from Doug. One night after dinner, Roger's phone buzzed. Unknown number. He answered warily. Hello. It was Doug. Hey, it's me. Silence. I saw you on TV, Doug said, voice softer than Roger had ever heard. I've been thinking. Roger didn't speak. I was wrong, Doug continued. We both were. But you changed. I saw it in your face. I ain't there yet, but I want to try. Roger sat down. Well, he said slowly, then I'll walk with you, one step at a time. And for the first time in years, two brothers talked, not about politics or pride, but about growth, forgiveness, and Emily. Chapter 27. The painted wall at the side of the community center, a mural began to take shape. Painted by teens, directed by a local black artist, and funded by both black and white families. It showed a river running through a town, with two hands reaching out from either bank, meeting in the middle. Marcus brought Emily to help paint butterflies. Roger painted trees. Below the mural in bold letters, change begins when courage speaks louder than fear. On opening day, the crowd gathered. Old folks in lawn chairs, kids in bright sneakers, church choirs, high school bands. Roger stood beside Marcus and whispered, We didn't just build a bridge, did we? Marcus smiled. Nope, we made it something people want to cross. Duojai lei fen shiks, du dwashtifanen hawanawan, jen huang 30,000 to sua kao chuyen. The racist couldn't believe his eyes when a black man saved his child. Jai lei fan jan dao nua sao kua han trin, noi sutai joy kong shila kan han, malan rong jen kong jong, jen hung the he kitiep. Chapter 28. The Bridge Gets Tested. The community center thrived. It hosted tutoring programs, food drives, free health screenings. People who once wouldn't sit at the same table now shared meals every Saturday. But then came the vandalism. One morning, Marcus arrived early to open up and found the mural defaced. Black paint slashed across the outstretched hands, and three ugly words sprayed in red. "Stay in your place." Roger got the call and rushed over. He stood beside Marcus, silent, fists clenched. "We knew it might come," Marcus said quietly. Roger looked at him, voice raw. "I want to find who did this." "We will," Marcus said, "but not with hate, not like that." Later that day, volunteers came out in force, young and old, black and white, brushes in hand. Emily stood on a stool and helped repaint the hands. Her touch was light but sure. They didn't just fix the mural, they made it stronger. Chapter 29, Confronting the Past. Roger decided to visit his old hometown for the first time in decades. He brought Marcus with him. They drove past fields where Roger once played baseball, the diner where he first heard his father say the N-word like it was nothing, and the church where Roger had been taught that people should stay with their own. "I thought this place raised me," Roger said as they drove, "but it really just shaped me." They parked in front of the house where Roger grew up, now abandoned. Roger stood on the porch for a long time. "I want to leave something behind." He took out a small wooden sign he'd made the week before. He hammered it into the dirt. It read, "Hate lived here, but it ends with me." Marcus stood beside him in silence. Then he nodded. "That's how you break the chain." Chapter 30, Emily's Big Idea. Back home, Emily had an idea. She pitched it one night over dinner. "I want to start a kids' book club," she said, eyes wide. "But not just any books. Books about people who are different. Different skin, different places, different everything." Karen smiled. "That's a beautiful idea." Roger chuckled. "Think other kids will want that." "They already do," Emily said. "I asked them. Some kids never read books with black people in them, or Asians, or anyone different." Marcus helped design the flyer. They called it Books Beyond Borders. At the first meeting, 15 kids showed up. By the third week, there were 40. A local librarian offered space, and soon schools asked if they could replicate the idea. Emily beamed. Roger watched her and thought, this is what legacy looks like. Chapter 31, The Second Rescue. It was a random Tuesday. Roger and Marcus were driving back from a speaking engagement when they saw the smoke. A house 2 blocks from Roger's place was on fire. Without thinking, both men jumped from the truck and ran toward it. A woman screamed from the sidewalk, "My son! He's still inside!" The front door was jammed. Smoke was pouring out. Sirens blared in the distance. Marcus didn't hesitate. "Help me bust it!" Together, they got it open. Marcus went in first, Roger right behind. They found the boy, 7, unconscious, tucked behind the sofa. Marcus carried him out. Roger guided the mother away from the flames. When it was over, paramedics said the boy would live. The local paper ran another front-page story, "The Men Who Keep Saving Us." And this time, no one cared about the color of their skin. Chapter 32. When doors opened themselves one day, Marcus was called to City Hall. He thought it was a permit issue. Instead, he was greeted by the mayor and the city council. "We've watched what you've done," the mayor said, "and we'd like to offer you a position, Director of Community Engagement. It's part-time, flexible, but it carries weight." Marcus blinked. "Me?" Roger, who'd come along for support, grinned. "Damn right you." Marcus accepted. He wasn't interested in titles, but he saw what the position meant, real influence, and a seat at the table he was once locked out of. That night, he and Roger toasted with sweet tea on the porch. "We ever think we'd be sitting here, talking city policy?" Marcus asked. Roger chuckled. "Hell no." Marcus raised his glass. "To not staying in our place." Roger clinked his glass back. Amen. Chapter 40. The school, naming the school board meeting, was packed. They were deciding the name of a new elementary school, built where 2 communities had once divided a town like an invisible fence. People argued for local historical figures. Some pushed for neutrality. Then a student, 12-year-old Maya James, raised her hand. "Why not name it after the 2 people who brought this community together?" she said. "They didn't build monuments. They built bridges." The room fell quiet. A week later, the vote was unanimous. The new school would be called Whitmore Bell Elementary. On opening day, Roger and Marcus stood under the arch as the first batch of kindergartners walked through, holding tiny hands. Emily, now a confident high school senior, hugged them both. "This," she whispered, "feels like magic." Chapter 41. Ghosts in the Attic. During a spring cleaning, Roger went up to the attic, somewhere he hadn't been in years. Old boxes, dusty albums, forgotten relics of a man he used to be. He found a stack of cassette tapes, his father's voice preaching about preserving the white race. Found old newsletters from groups he now couldn't believe he once tolerated. Roger sat for hours, listening, holding, remembering. And then he burned them, not in anger, but in release. Downstairs, Marcus was sanding a chair for the community center. Roger handed him a beer. "Let's fill that attic with something better." Chapter 42. The Podcast. A college student approached Marcus after a panel talk. "I'm starting a podcast," she said. "Would you and Roger be my first guests?" They laughed. "What's it called?" Roger asked. She grinned. "The Bridge Didn't Build Itself." Each episode featured different people, from reformed gang members to school teachers to immigrants. But episode 1, Marcus and Roger's story, became the most shared. The podcast spread. Soon, high school curriculums added it to media classes. One teacher emailed Marcus, "My students cried." Then they started asking what bridges they could build in their own lives. Chapter 43. The Last Storm. Years later, a storm rolled in, eerily like the one that had changed everything. Only this time the creek didn't overflow. The treehouse Marcus and Roger had built for Emily stayed standing. They watched the rain together from the porch, older now, slower. Roger held a cup of tea. "Storms used to scare me." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Really?" "Not the weather, the kind that breaks your whole world open." Marcus nodded. "Some storms clean more than they destroy." Roger sipped and smiled. "Amen." Chapter 44. Emily's Choice. Emily got accepted into 4 universities, but her choice surprised everyone. She chose to stay home for now and work at the Bridge full-time. "There's still work to do here," she told the board during her interview, "and I want to help kids like me see the world before fear tells them who not to trust." Marcus called her afterward. "You make us proud." Roger added, "You made us better." She laughed. "Just following your lead." Chapter 45. Legacy in Bloom. At the side of the community center, where the mural still stood, volunteers planted a garden. Each plant was chosen by someone in the neighborhood. Every color, every bloom different. No one cared who planted what. They just planted. Marcus and Roger visited every Sunday, bringing coffee and small tools. They didn't speak as much anymore. Didn't need to. Their bond had moved past words. One day a child ran by and waved. "Hey, Mr. Marcus. Hey, Mr. Roger." They waved back. And as the child disappeared around the corner, Roger whispered, "That's the sound of hope, isn't it?" Marcus smiled. "And peace." Chapter 46. The Anniversary. 10 years. That's how long it had been since the day at the creek. The town held a gathering to mark the anniversary, not of the incident, but of the unity that followed. They called it Bridge Day. Banners were strung from lampposts. A photo exhibit was placed in the library. Students recited essays. Local artists performed original songs. Roger stood behind the podium, voice steady despite age. 10 years ago, I thought I knew who I was, but I was wrong. A man I didn't understand saved my daughter and gave me back my soul." He turned to Marcus. "And a friend." Marcus stepped up next. "I didn't jump into that creek expecting thanks. I did it because that's what we should do for each other, no matter how the world tells us to divide." The crowd stood in silence. Then applause, slow at first, but then loud and full. Chapter 47. The Creek Stone. Later that week, a stone marker was placed near the edge of the creek. Carved into it, "In this water a child was saved. In that moment, so was a heart." People left flowers. Children touched the stone and asked their parents to tell the story. And they did, not with shame, not with judgment, but with hope. Chapter 48. The Final Project. Roger and Marcus decided to build one last thing together, a learning garden beside Whitmore Bell Elementary. Raised beds, solar-powered watering system, benches under shady trees. They worked slowly. Roger's back wasn't what it used to be, but the joy was in the effort. Kids would come out for recess and wave. Teachers brought out science classes to learn about pollinators. One morning, a young girl asked Marcus, "Did you really save her?" He smiled. "We saved each other." Chapter 49. The book. A publishing house approached Emily. They wanted her to write a memoir. At first, she refused. "This isn't just my story," she said. But Marcus encouraged her. "You're the thread that connects it all." She titled the book, "The Day My Dad Learned to Breathe." In it, she wrote, "People talk about heroes like they're larger than life. But my hero was just a man who didn't hesitate. And my father? He became a hero when he admitted his fear and let go of it." The book became a bestseller. It was read in classrooms, cited in seminars, translated into 4 languages. But for Roger, all that mattered was the dedication. For Dad and Marcus, who taught me courage looks different on everyone, and love doesn't care what color you are. Chapter 50. The Quiet Day. One quiet day, Roger and Marcus sat on a bench near the creek. Older now, white-haired, hands slower. They didn't talk much, just watched the water flow. Then Marcus spoke. "Ever wonder why you didn't jump that day?" Roger didn't answer for a long time. Then he said, "So you could." They laughed softly. "Glad you did," Roger added. Marcus placed a hand on his friend's shoulder. "So am I." Chapter 51. The Farewell. The years caught up with Roger. Nothing sudden, just the slow rhythm of time marking its claim. He became quieter, needed more rest. Still stubborn, still sharp, but gentler now. One evening after dinner at the bridge, he pulled Marcus aside. "If I go first," he said, "don't let anyone turn my funeral into a flag-waving, small-town ceremony." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "You want jazz music and plant-based hors d'oeuvres?" Roger laughed. "I want the truth. Tell them who I was and who I became." Marcus nodded. "Deal." Chapter 52. The Last Breath. It happened on a Sunday, peaceful, warm. Karen found him in his reading chair, the book still open, glasses tilted. The sun had set softly behind him, the same way it rose on the day Emily was born. They held a small service, exactly how Roger asked. No pretense, no speeches filled with fluff. Marcus stood last. He looked at the crowd, some who had once whispered, others who had long embraced the man Roger became. He said, he was wrong. Then he made it right. He held on to hate. Then he let it go. And in doing so, he gave the rest of us permission to change too. Chapter 53. The Letter to Marcus. A week later, Marcus received a sealed envelope. Inside was Roger's handwriting. "Dear brother, if you're reading this, I've gone ahead. Hopefully peacefully and hopefully not wearing those awful hospital gowns. I didn't thank you enough, not just for saving Emily, but for staying, for challenging me, for not writing me off when you had every right to. You turned me into a man I'm finally proud of. You didn't just give me a second chance, you gave me something better, a friend. Keep going, keep showing up. I'll be with you, every bridge you build." Roger Marcus read it 3 times, then folded it carefully, and cried for the man who once couldn't look him in the eye, and later trusted him with everything. Chapter 54. Emily's turn. Emily took up her father's role at the bridge, not because it was expected, but because it was right. She spoke at schools, hosted open mic nights, led the garden project her father helped build, and every year on Bridge Day, she read from her father's favorite book. Not the Bible, not a biography, but a worn, marked-up copy of To Kill a Mockingbird. Atticus said, "You never really understand a person until you climb into his skin and walk around in it," she quoted. My dad didn't just walk, he ran. Chapter 55. The Final Image. 20 years after that fateful day by the creek, a young boy walked into Whitmore Bell Elementary for the first time. He passed the statue out front, 2 figures frozen mid-motion, and tugged on his mother's sleeve. "Who are they?" She knelt beside him. They're the reason this school exists, she said. One saved a life, the other saved a soul, and together, they changed everything. The end.